present my thesis on how baselines in pop music contribute to cover song identification. So motivational project is actually my mom visited New York and we went to jazz bar and then we were listening to music and she really liked the music and then she would try to get out the iPhones and use the Shazam to identify the song that has been playing in live. But obviously Shazam doesn't work with that application because the Shazam is actually comparing the chunk of audio with a proprietary data sets using the audio fingerprinting technology. So because the cover song or live version of song has key difference, tempo difference, timbre difference, rhythm difference, or instrumentation difference. So it's very hard to using the Shazam or SoundHound or other application. But at the moment I realized that if I can design something like cover song identification application, that would be very interesting. So I did a couple of research and then I realized that some research on melody using melody features or chronogram, which is pitch class profile, which is representation of pitch. So these using that features seems like it's working with the cover song identification. But since I'm bassist, I realized that maybe if I can use bass as a feature for the comparing the original song and the cover song, that would be very interesting. So here's first. And then if you hear this bass line, you can easily tell, oh, this is Queens, and then you pull it from the under pressure, or maybe. Sorry. So if you hear this, you can easily identify, oh, this is Billie Jean from Michael Jackson. So I realized that maybe if I can extract the bass lines from the audio file and use that as the features to compute the similarity to identify the cover song, that would be very interesting. So I created three main systems. One system is TN based. Basically, this first system to detect pitch from the monophonic audio. Monophonic means just like bass line, no guitar, no vocal, no piano, just like detecting the fundamental frequency of the bass line. And then the reason why I made this system is to train transition matrix, which is like when you play C1, what is the probability goes to like C2, C sharp 1 or G1 or something like that. Also, I need to create pitches with label because I'm going to use the supervised learning method in the second section. So since limited time, I'm not going to explain everything about this being based, but this is a reference of my thesis. So basically, I just want to say approximately 70% of accuracy of baseline detection for this first system. And for the second system, is baseline extraction. Is to extract the bassline from polyphonic music, these audio signals, which means there's a drum, piano, keyboard, synthesizer, but the system can only extract the bass lines. Because later I use that future vector to compare the cover song and the original song. So here's, since we have a limited of time, I'm not going to explain everything, but here's a methodology result and discussion. But I just want to say approximately 6% of accuracy in pitch recall. So this is the output from the second system. So you have a pitch information, and it's going to be 36 pitches because bass typically has 3 octaves, so it's going to be 36 pitches. And then also time frame, which is the time. So each song will have this kind of output to compare with the cover song or original song or other song. So here's my main core system, compute similarity of baseline feature vector to identify the cover song. So here's the review. We have key difference because like sometimes female wants to sing the male song, or tempo difference. For the live version, people play very fast or slow, or timbre, they using other instrument like a sound of instrument like electric guitar or acoustic guitar, or rhythm obviously could be difference, or instrumentation difference. So here's a design diagram of my cover song identification. So query means like whatever you're asking for. The reference is the kind of data sets you have. And then base pitch class profile is the output of the second system. And then it goes to optimal transposition index. And yep, which is to approach the key invariance. So obviously, as I told you, there's a key invariance when you're doing a cover song. This technique is to what is the best, how many transposition you require to create the maximum level resemblance for the dot product. So idea is just you have a matrix, but make it like a single vectors with 36 pitches, and then split it because like you have 3 octaves, so 12, 12, 12, and add them up. And then also for the query, you do the same thing, and then do dot product between these 2 vectors. Then for the query, you transpose, and then find how much transpose is required to output the maximum value for the dot product. So then this system can kind of identify, okay, you have to transpose 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that. And after that, delay coordinate embedding, which is to find out what is the as I told you, there's a tempo difference, or and then if you have a tempo difference, obviously there's going to be non-linearity from the cover song and original song. So delay coordinate embedding is very famous technique for non-linear mathematics. That basically instead of using 36 pitches, you embedded like delayed samples. For this case, if you decide dimension as 15, you can embed it like 14 delayed samples for each pitch class. I'm going to want to explain more for detail, but sorry for limited time, so I'm going to just, I think that in page 27 it's explained very well. And then after that, now is the time to compare the original song and then cover song, which is I'm using cross recurrence plotting idea. So the left one is base pitch profile, delay embedded pitch base profile, and then from the reference, and the right one is query. We basically compute the Euclidean distance for these 2 frames, the matrix. And then you get something like this, but maybe this is hard to see, so we want to binarize the Euclidean distance matrix. Typically, when you binarize information, like we have a fixed threshold, and if value go over the fixed threshold, it's going to be 1. If value go lower the threshold, it's going to be 0. So, but instead of using a fixed threshold, I decided to use the so it's like only k% of ones are shown on the plot. Means like just picking up the highest 20% value, 40% value for this case. So I'm just to simplify this, but like you have 1, 3, 2, 4, 5, 4 and 5. Obviously the highest the 2 numbers. So black is 1 and gray is 0 for the vertical directions. And then next one is horizontal direction. You pick the highest 2 numbers, and then you later logically end it, and you find this cross-return plot. The reason why it's vertical and horizontal computations better is like you can find similarity for the vertical direction, which is for the query, and then also horizontal for the reference. So this is kind of the example of the cross-recurrent plot. So on the left one, if you use with the same song, you can find a distinct diagonal lines from upper left to lower right. And also for the cover song, you kind of see oblique line or partial diagonal lines. And then also if you do that with a different song, you find no diagonal line or oblique lines. For human, it's visually you can find, oh, there's an oblique line, maybe it's close, it has a similarity or something like that. But we have to find some way to quantify this cross-recurrence plot. To do that, I just recursively measure the longest linear or non-linear line from the cross-recurrent plot. the way is like, okay, pick up, oh, this is the longest line. So this value is going to be a kind of like, I should say index, or the output of the combination between cover song and original song, or the query and reference. So for same song, here. So this one comparing same song. So you see very distinct diagonal. But for cover song, you see like a partial oblique diagonal lines. And also for the different song. Call my name. I heat up like a burning flame. So you find a very shorter line. So you kind of like identify each combination. Okay, highest point is like 2,400. So this is gonna be the cover song, or this is has the Qmax. The Qmax is the length of the highest point, and then it's gonna be the smaller value. So this is not cover song or. So for the evaluation, I checked with 80 original songs, and then also 80 cover songs from the originals, from the data set from Alice. And then, so it's gonna be total 6,400 combination of computation, the cross-recurrent plot. And so here's my result. The lowest one is my result. So mine is like detect 30 cover songs out of 80, so which is like 37.5%. If you see the other state-of-the-art technology, you can find like 40%. The highest one is actually the CRQ using cross-recurrent plot with chromogram, which is detect 58 cover song out of 80, so which is 72%. So this one is using chromogram, as I told you, like a representation of each class for each songs, instead of only the baselines. So here's my result. So you can see black dot is showing that the cover song of the original location or rank of the cover song of the originals. So you can see my system successfully detected like 30 songs, so means rank 1. And then also it's like a kind of other songs like are located like something like 80 or 60, or so it's not everything is in higher similarities. So error analysis. So I would like to know why my system cannot identify good cover song. So first thing is the instrumentation. If you hear this, like you can hear a very distinct bass line out of this song. And if you hear this, you don't hear a lot of bass line. So this one is just using vocal and acoustic guitar. And then although like sounds a little similar, but since this bass line is like the one is like 39, which is less similarity. So the first problem may be instrumentation, and then another one is kick drum. So unfortunately, my system is saying, "Oh, Walk This Way" is a cover song of Face from George Michael, which is which is very far.
Now
so so here's assumption that when I play this, it has like a distinct repetitive bass and kick sounds, and if you hear Walk This Way, very strong the kick drums, and if you hear this, sometimes like this kick drum and the bass line is match the timing, and since like the kick drum or the percussive sound typically have a wider range of the frequency. So maybe when the system realizes that, oh, this is they are since matching, so maybe baseline is matching, so this is these two songs has a higher similarity. And then also another one is transposition during songs. So my generation by Fu is actually covered by Green Day. And then I would like to here first. So if you hear this, this is the key in G major, and the next one is the same like a block style band and drum and guitar and vocal, but like as you see, this OTI is showing the one means there's a difference between the key difference is one semitone, but actually this Green Day song transposed to G sharp measure in the middle of the song. So this and then the run is 79, which is like very far similarity between these two songs. So I open up the cross recurrent plot for this My Generation Foo and then My Generation Green Day, and it seems like after transposition there's some kind of like different kind of characteristics of the CRQ. Like in the orange box you see like a partial, like it's very partial, partial diagonal oblique lines, but once it's transposed, like it's all like horizontal lines. So it's saying that maybe for the system, this is once it's transposed, that's the system may fall off, because we are using OTI, which is like you basically create 136 pitches by one vectors. But since the song is transposed middle of the song, when you try to do that product, it's kind of like fell off the computation. So there's three problems I was thinking. So for the conclusion, so baselines can be featured to identify the cover song, but seems like the state-of-the-art method is better. So like because like as I told you, refer the result from other research. Like I'm thinking maybe some cover songs do not have a baselines and different style of baselines, and then a kick drum might confuse the system. Then also key change in the middle of the song might be a problem. And for the future work, need to optimize parameters for cross recurrent plot and then recurrence plot quantification, because actually there's a lot of parameters I have to work with. Number of dimension for the delay embedded coordination, or delay unit, how many samples you are going to delay, or the penalty, which is when you computing the Qmax value, like you have to kind of decide like penalty values. So I'm thinking maybe in the future I have to optimize this all the parameters using machine learning to create a good result instead of like empirically working on it. And then also maybe integrate grading chroma, which is the presentation of pitch or melody, may increase the accuracy. So that will be my future work. And then that's it. Thank you.
You say this is great. I have so this is like, to me, a beautiful example of where like the research toward one hypothesis implies a different hypothesis, right? So one of the things is like, given this analysis workflow you've come up with, what kind of other similarities do you think you could find? Maybe like say like, don't worry about cover songs. Let's talk about like, you can use it to maybe detect categories of musical style, right?
Yes.
Or commonalities in harmonic sequences in pop. Or can you give me a sense of like?
Yeah, I think if you're using the cross recurrent plot, especially if you're using the pitch classical file, you can identify like the harmonic, the sequence idea, or because it's finding similarity between pitch classical files. So I think harmonic ideas that will be that can be possible. But I'm not sure about the rhythmic patterns, but like drum, because I'm try to extract all the pitch dimension. So
sure.
Analyzing rhythm might be difficult for this system.
Sure. Yeah. But I mean, you talk a lot about like you know, like one of the things you're trying to, like you talk, it's cool in the paper actually how you talk about like all the dimensions that you try to bulletproof against, right? So like you figure out how to fix like the covers in a different key, like doing the dot product transposition thing, but that screws up if the cover song changes key in the middle, right? And you talk a lot about bulletproofing it against genre, like genre shift is like the Achilles heel of this whole thing, because there are a lot of cover songs like there is no bass line, or it's like half the tempo, or like they do something experimental with the harmony that messes everything up. But just in listening, like, you know, like George Michael's Faith, you know, a cover of George Michael's Faith might not sound like George Michael's Faith, but Bruce Springsteen's song, She's the One, sounds exactly like George Michael's Faith, because it's the same song, right? It just has a different lyric or whatever, you know, and so that's what I was sort of more thinking of, like commonalities, not maybe between covers, but just between songs.
Yeah. To find a similarity, yes, I think this can be possible. Like, I don't know, maybe I wrote in the paper, but like maybe in the future, like you can find it, like it's just this song and this song is too similar. Maybe it's copyright infringement or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So not only cover song, but this technique can be applied for other applications.
So congratulations, Suzuki. I think you did a great job. It's a remarkable amount of work.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't think you do the best job at selling it, because I mean, even in the thesis, like you put a lot of emphasis, like even in the presentation today, you put a lot of emphasis in the cover song, almost to the detriment of everything that you did with transcription, where you actually have very good results in transcription. So if I were you, that's the thing I would talk about more, right? Because you actually got pretty amazing results in transcription that you should be proud and you should talk about more, I think. And then, you know, there is, piggybacking a little bit on Luke's comment, there is an issue of like, once you extract that kind of information, it's a lot of stuff that you can do that is beyond just the one application that you try. And somehow the results that you're getting are not surprising, right? Because I mean, cover songs are not defined only by the bass line, right? The same way that they are not defined only by the melody, they're not only defined by the chord progression. I think to me, like the interesting thing here would be to see if you do a fusion of all these different types of information that you're collecting from the audio signal, where you actually get a better characterization of the range of covers that you can identify this way, or the range of similarities to be more general, you know, I'm talking about, you know, different ways in which you identify this particular baseline being used or reused by an artist in a completely different song in an interesting way. And I think, you know, it would be interesting to explore the use of technologies for those other interesting products out there, right? And so I think there is value to that. The devil is always in the details. And there are a few things that, as I was reading through, caught my attention, right? So one is at the level of systems, there is a lot of steps and moving parts. And sometimes I'm not entirely sure why you took those particular decisions, and that's not necessarily completely justifying it in the write-up. So I'm just wondering, like for instance, like when you do P-in, right, you introduce an FFT, right? So in is normally in the time domain. You do it in the spectral domain. And you do an autocorrelation before you actually compute a difference function. But you don't give us a lot of insight as to why you're using those two extra steps in there and what difference do they make. When you do the transcription part, you have the harmonic percussive separation with a bunch of characters to play. You have all these intermediate steps that they add complexity to the system. So can you give us some insight? I mean, why those decisions? I mean, why is that better than the?
So for the first harmonic percussive source separation system, my intention was, since kick drum and bass line, they're sharing the same frequency, so obviously it's going to be kind of like detrimental when you try to extract the bass line from polyphonic music, because they're sharing same the frequency. So I thought HPSS can correctly separate the kick drum and the bass line. So that was my first intention. But since a lot of kick drum seems like I'll have a lot of, since HPSS is trying to find smoothness in time domain, and smoothness in percussive domain. So, so it's very workable for snare or cymbal with a lot of percussive sound, but kick drum typically has very smoothness in the time domain. So it seems like HPSS, yes. So the HPSS seems like doesn't do a good job on separating kick drum and bass line. So that's kind of one of conclusion that I got from this HPSS.
And so you rely on the fact that the kick drum is kind of pitch invariant, right? Like you can make this kind of nice assumption that the thing that isn't moving is probably the thing that's never moving is not the bass line, it's the kick drum, right?
Right, because I think that's a very good point, because it's like the issue in my mind is not the specific techniques. I think all of those techniques could be tweaked to do what you want them to do. I think the problem is that there are so many of them that it's very difficult to come up with an optimal configuration for the entire system. And I feel that a lot of what you do will benefit from more simplicity, right? So like let's strip it down to the really basics, right? And to really start to work on the tweaks of a specific point to get what you need out of it. Because I feel there are way too many moving parts, and I don't get a sense that you manage to find a magical formula to optimize that process, right? So, and I think your results are part by that, right? It's like, and even at the very basic level, I think there's some questionable decisions at the level of the STFT that you're computing, and that's at the very beginning of your pipeline. I'm not sure that you have the necessary resolution to do everything that you do afterwards. I mean, that's a trick with low frequency analysis, right? So you might want to revisit, and I can give you very specific comments on that. But I think there are some, you're asking the machine to do a lot without probably enough resolution to discriminate between those things.
So you're saying that discriminating between C1 and
Right.
C#1, the two parts. So I should have more frequency resolution.
Yeah, I think you don't have necessarily.
Your time slicing too small to get the frequency.
Well, it's more like the relationship between the sampling rate and the window size is not quite right, and you're beyond the quarter tone band size, and that means that you don't have a good way to resolve it between two semitones at that that first stage especially. And when you look at your chroma, you see it, right? You see all that model in the bottom. Right? So I think those things will make life easier for all the other things that you do afterwards, and you really take some time to go figure out. So then one final suggestion maybe before you handle this is just to give it one more proofread. I think there are a lot of little opportunities for improving the language and changing grammar and little typos here and there. So I think the thesis will benefit from that. Just one final once over and then submit it. Okay.
That's great.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Everybody. All right.
So this is
Hey.
for you, right?
What?
This is it for you.
This is it for me.
I'll send you an email.
All right. Good. Anything you asked, Jay?
Yeah, that was fun.
I read some notes in that job.
Yes.
You read it?
Well, I have this, and I have a concept, and then I have this.
No, you know,
Oh, no,
Yusuke. Yusuke.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh. I was like,
Yusuke. Did you already sign the release form for the? Okay.
Do you need it now?
No, I'm just checking that they signed it.
just an hour ago. I think it just took a while to too.
Does your computer see another screen?
Yes.
Every morning downstairs.
Because yours doesn't recognize that there's something else.
Yeah, it does.
It does. I can reselect it here too.
Yeah,
It just doesn't work.
You should
I'll
have done
reselect it.
blue, right? You unplug it. Should have showed like blue.
Oh, yeah.
Just like reset. I should really suddenly worked.
Then just check to see if your computer sees it. What's the?
USB-C. Can you use an electric computer? I'll bring mine if you want. Or do you have
Everything precise. Where's the camera for this one? This 180 to 180 camera, so they're being picked up by CB. Oh, they can.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I know. Oh, yeah.
Julia, do you want to switch to floorbox? Where are you?
No, I mean, I think it's, I don't think it's this.
Okay. It has a delay, of course.
I thought maybe it would like rethink it.
So,
There we go. All right. We just switch times. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Colin Fahey. I'll be presenting my thesis on the automatic detection of musical sampling using scale invariant feature transform. What essentially this is a repurposing of a feature from the field of computer vision for object recognition, repurposed to do audio fingerprinting, and then the task of audio fingerprinting is sort of repurposed as sample detection. So when we're talking about sampling, we mean when a piece of audio, of an audio recording is used to create a new musical content. And specifically for this project, we're talking about when that source audio is itself musical content, not like sampling a soundscape or music or movie quotes. This is a technique that began in the 1940s with musique concrète. This was done with tape loops. It became popular more in mainstream with early hip hop, which is vinyl recordings, and today is very prevalent in electronic and across pop music. And so I mentioned this. This changed from vinyl to sampler, and then today it's generally done just in software. And I mentioned this because of the way it's become more prevalent. It's become especially more simpler to do digital signal processing on this. And like with early hip hop or vinyl, you could sort of scale the pitch and tempo, but only together by increasing the speed or decreasing the speed of playback. But now you can sort of adjust pitch and tempo independent of each other with digital signal processing. So why do we want to automatically detect this? First thing everyone mentions when I bring up this topic is the legal issues. Regardless of how you feel on the topic, there's definitely many people who would benefit from being able to automatically detect when the track has sampled, whether it's artists or copyright holders who want to protect their, their intellectual property, whether to take it down or just to collect royalties on that. We've seen that automatic audio fingerprinting has sort of transformed some of the user-generated content sites like YouTube or SoundCloud, where they're automatically detecting and taking down tracks that violate copyright. You could see how a system like this could be added to SoundCloud to either take down new tracks that are using sampling, or at least identify the owner of that original track. Where I'm kind of more interested is the musicological perspective. I've been interested in tracing the influence of tracks of music over time, which is a pretty difficult task, I would imagine, to approach from a music information retrieval perspective. But sampling is one objective measure of influence you can actually see. Take out some of the subjective context there. And then just the sampling data itself has intrinsic value, which can be seen on the website whosampled.com, which is a large influence on this project, using it for the ground truth labels. There's just thousands of music listeners out there who are interested in this sampling information. So this isn't a completely new topic. It's been sample recognition has been approached by a few people. Whitney and later in 2013 proposed a system that used non-narrative matrix factorization to detect samples, and it had pretty good results, nearly 80% accuracy. But they only did an evaluation on one album by a tribe called Quest, and really just the NMF is kind of a costly process. It's not really scalable to a large-scale detection system. And Balin in 2012 proposed a modified fingerprinting algorithm that had not nearly as good results, but is much more scalable. Only issue is the algorithm they used. It's not really robust to pitch shift or time stretching at all. They got around that a little bit by manually transposing all the input tracks, but then you can only sort of deal with these discrete values that you give, and it's not a great general purpose for detecting any type of sample. So I really like the way Casey and Slaney put out this sort of representation of music similarity tests, where you've got on one end the most specific, where you're identifying an exact recording with audio fingerprinting. One end sort of more generic similarity with something like genre classification. And they were doing remix recognition, which they placed somewhere in the middle. Something like cover song recognition would be somewhere in the middle here too, because these things kind of keep some of the higher level musical structure. But really, I'd say that general sample detection is really just over here with fingerprinting. We're detecting one exact recording that's being used in another song. How it differs from fingerprinting, or at least some of the challenges, is that now this sample is embedded within other musical content. So some of the algorithms that have worked for audio fingerprinting, namely the most popular systems just sort of detect the peak frequency at every frame. And if you've got multiple musical things going on at once, if your sample is maybe farther back in the mix, it's going to be shrouded by that other frequency content that won't be covered. And just some other things, that the pitch shifting, time stretching, which I've mentioned, is very commonly done. You need a sample to fit into your musical context, and filtering is often applied too. The good news is that audio fingerprinting has already addressed some of these issues, specifically pitch shifting and time stretching. One of the main reasons possibly is because people are trying to get around this copyright protection. You might pitch shift your upload by a half step before uploading it to YouTube so that it doesn't get taken down because their algorithm won't detect it. One of the best recent systems that has worked well at being robust to these pitch shift and time shifts is from Zhang et al. Last year in 2015, which used the scale invariant feature transform. So they took this feature from object recognition. And so this was proposed by David Lowe in 1999 originally. So it's used in images to detect objects. And what it does is it takes an image and finds high contrast points, and then extracts a feature vector to describe the local area around that key point. And what's great about this is that it's robust to changes in orientation, translation, scaling, partial occlusion, and illumination. And this was something that Zeng noticed when they realized they could extract these features from a spectrogram image. Really, a spectrogram image and a grayscale picture don't differ much. They're both a matrix of intensity values, really. Just the this scale, the axes represent different things. But in a spectrogram image, time stretching is represented by a scaling of the image along the horizontal axis. And pitch shifting, if you compute your spectrogram using a logarithmic frequency scale, for instance using like the constant Q transform rather than a Fourier transform, then pitch shifting is simply translation along the y-axis. So because of this, they were able to get very great robustness to changes in time stretching and pitch shifting compared to some of the other state-of-the-art audio fingerprinting algorithms. Now I noticed anyway, but so what I also noticed is that these features are also robust to partial occlusion, which I think addresses the first issue you brought up of samples being embedded within other musical content, where part of the sample might be covered by other frequency content, but at least some of it is not occluded, and that's what these features are robust to. And also, being robust to illumination changes is very similar to filtering in a spectrum image. The gradient orientations don't change, just the magnitudes of those gradients in the 2D space. All right, great. So the overall process, we build a constant Q transform-based spectrogram to get that logarithmic frequency scale. Extract the SIFT key points and descriptors from that. So we fill a database of all these from a known source set, and then for each query, we extract the same features and find their approximate nearest neighbors. I'll go over threshold and clustering in a bit. So I need to talk about SIFT since it's the main purpose of this. It's really, there's really two processes going on in SIFT. The first that are really separate is the key point detection and then descriptor feature vector extraction from those key points. So for detection, what they do is you take an image and then apply Gaussian blur at varying levels to this image. You're essentially smoothing it by different amounts, and then between each of these adjacent images, you subtract them to get this difference of Gaussian scale space, as Datalow referred to it. So now in this scale space, you can look at every single point in this 3D scale space and compare it to its 26 neighbors to determine whether it's a maximum or minimum in this 3D space. And then all those extrema are determined to be key points. So now at each key point, we need to extract a feature vector. This is done if your key point was right here in the middle, you'd look at the surrounding pixels, determine the gradient vectors at each point, the orientation and the magnitude of each of these changes. And then you summarize these 4x4 areas into one bin of 8 histogram values for the 8 ordinal and cardinal directions. So you get a summarize of the values here. And here's where normalization is applied to these magnitudes, and that's what accounts for the robustness to illumination changes or filtering in the case of spectrograms. And this is a more simplified version. It's actually a 16 by 16 space. And so we've got 4x4 descriptor with 8 values in each one for 128 values per feature vector. This is what it looks like on an image. You take an image, take the grayscale image, you'll extract a bunch of key points from it. This is more sparse than, this is a subset of the actual key points you generally extract. And you got a descriptor of the 4x4 for each one. And then if you've got 2 images of the same objects, to the same roots, you can extract these key points and find all their nearest neighbors. Now some of the caveats of SIFT is that it's a 128-dimensional feature vector. That's pretty large compared to some of the other fingerprint things that are something like 1 or 2 values per fingerprint. And because they're only local area descriptors, you need to extract a lot of them to get decent coverage, or sections of the spectrogram won't have any thing to describe it. So because of this, in my evaluation, I end up with somewhere on the order of 50 million key points, each 128 values. It's very large. We can't really do brute force nearest neighbor matching. It would take a very long time. So because of that, we use approximate nearest neighbor. This is a method of finding the actual nearest neighbor with high probability, but no guarantee. What this does is it's a slight reduction in performance, generally less than 5% accuracy loss, but orders of magnitude faster, so much less computational time. So it makes this really possible. And the algorithm I'm using in this project is Spotify Annoy. Stands for approximate nearest neighbor, oh yeah. And there's many different implementations of approximate nearest neighbor. They all address the same concept, that slight reduction in performance, but faster speed. I went with this one just because in my initial tests I tried a bunch, and this one was much faster for me, so it made testing a lot easier to just stick with that. So these first three steps are sort of the same covered by Zhang et al. In their paper, where we take the spectrogram, extract the key points, and find the nearest neighbors. And that worked well enough for them for audio fingerprinting, where they just had to return the track that had the most matches. It's a little different, at least in the way I phrased this project, that most of these matches are going to be false matches, right? Because most of a track is not composed of samples. So most of these key points will not have a correct match in the database. So for that, we apply thresholding and clustering. So the thresholding is to remove false matches. David Lowe found that these SIF descriptors vary wildly in their descriptive power between each descriptors of a different area, and so an absolute threshold is not very effective, as correct matches could have wildly different distances. So instead, they use a ratio thresholding to find the distance between the nearest neighbor and the nearest known incorrect neighbor. And this is done by finding the second neighbor being the closest neighbor that came from a different track. And this only works if we know that our database, in our data set of source tracks, none of them sample from each other. So this was a requirement when I built the data set. And then just so this theta value of the ratio between the two nearest neighbors had best results at around 0.9. And then after that, we still have a lot of false matches, and so clustering helps with that, where instead of just returning the one with the most matches, we want matches that all came from the same area or that agree on a shape. So it's kind of a version of the generalized Huff transform that is basically used to group matches that agree on a shape. So if we had a bunch of matches like here, then after applying clustering, we'd end up with these that agreed on this sort of trapezoidal shape, whereas these other ones are different angles and don't have the same shape. And then we keep the clusters with 3 or more. So this is what it looks like on music. So here's our spectrogram. We detect approximately 10,000 key points per track. And they are in green. If we zoom in on an area like this, you can see what they look like. You can see they're varying in sizes based on the level of scale that the extra were detected at. So some of them represent larger areas. And back here. So now for each key point, we can find its nearest neighbor in the database. And we've got tons of neighbors. And this isn't really very helpful. So after here, because most, 99% of these are false matches. So after applying ratio thresholding, this is what we're left with. So there's still, quite a few false matches, but we can see that there are a whole bunch coming from this track over here. And then after applying clustering and keeping clusters of 3 or more, we're left with just this one track. Each cluster is represented by a different color here. And so this track at the bottom here is Amen Brother by the Winstons. Right here is that famous Amen break drum loop, the Amen drum loop. And up here is Straight Outta Compton by NWA. And you can see that this drum loop is sampled throughout the track. So for the evaluation, I got the ground truth labels from whosampled.com and also collected the tracks from there. I used their list of the 50 most influential tracks. Okay. And for each of those, found their 10 most popular tracks that sampled from them. For 466, because some of these sample from multiple of those 50. And then I also padded the database with several thousand noise tracks. And these aren't literally noise, they're other published tracks with from the same genre and year as the 50 here. And so what this looks like, right? So we build the source database with all these tracks, extract the 50 million key points out of all of these, and then query it on each of these 466 derivatives to attempt to identify the 500 instances of sampling that came from this subset of 50 from here. Now I use this to compare to a baseline, probably the most cited paper in audio fingerprinting from Wang et al. From Shazam in 2004. And I used the open source implementation by Dan Ellis at Columbia of this algorithm. And it's the same one that was used by Van Balen that I mentioned earlier, except he also used this implementation, but I did not apply the transposition that he did. So it's only going to really detect tracks that didn't have any pitch shifting or time stretching applied to them. But using the open source implementation, I thought would be good. And this is the most known sample from Shazam. So it's going to see if this compared to what a simple audio fingerprint algorithm that would only detect very prevalent tracks. So, and basically the results with an F-score of about 0.35. This is decent. It's well above the baseline from the open source implementation, but it could be better. And so here's a plot of that, the precision versus recall of this. So over here we've got the baseline Shazam algorithm. Basically there were about 5 instances of sampling that it was very certain of. These were probably very prevalent in the mix and had no processing applied to them. But it basically didn't get much better as we tried to improve recall. And here, this is like a sweeping of the theta threshold, the ratio thresholding, to get either better recall or precision, and it's sort of best around here. So I tried to determine some of the failings of this, of why this wasn't working. And so I broke this down by instrument. These samples were labeled by instrument on whosample.com. And looking at this across different time resolution, you can see that, drums were basically always the best detected, or this is the plot against the recall rate. But interestingly, and kind of counterintuitive to me, is that vocal detection improved as we had better time resolution. This seemed counterintuitive because I was sort of imagining vocals as being long melodic lines. But as it turns out, a large portion of these vocals were sort of short utterances like hey and oh, and just kind of an example of one of the ones that the system had trouble with.
Hey, listen to the bass.
Sample from you hear the hey, it's very in the background and very short. But so anyway, in future work, I feel like more validation could be done, especially in determining where this is failing, what the types of samples that aren't working well, whether it's the types of instruments, how it's being embedded in other music, what kind of DSP effects are being applied. Another thought I had is sort of doing a 2-stage detection and confirmation, as some of the thresholds could be made more lenient to have an easy detection and with a lot of false positives, and then sort of confirmation stage, maybe even using the NMF algorithm or process from Whitney that wouldn't be scalable, but if we had a detection to limit the space, and then you could run an NMF on the small possibilities. And then, but ultimately, I think an alternative to SIP would be great. There have been alternatives in the past 10 years, Surf, Fast, Orb, that achieve the same thing, basically similar results, but they've decreased the computational time and size of the feature vector. But really, all of these are still made for images and object recognition. And I think that this has shown that this type of feature and describing local area of a spectrogram is effective and it works. It's well above the baseline. I just think to continue this, that sort of a more specific example geared towards music, maybe that could treat the two axes with different resolutions, so I wouldn't have to adjust the resolution of the spectrogram to get different results, and to adjust the density of these key points. Some of the issues that when you extract, there's no guarantee of how dense or sparse these key points are within a spectrogram. So some areas might have no features extracted from it, and if your sample was taken from right there, it might not be able to detect it. So I think if this were to be used more for fingerprinting, that it would be good to have a version that could guarantee how dense these features are spread throughout an image. And that's it. Thank you.
Great, very interesting. So a couple things. Yeah, I think that you are right in saying it would be a promising direction to find how to make this more geared toward a spectrogram and less towards an image.
Mm-hmm.
But even with the image key points that you were showing there, it wasn't picking out some of what I would think of as the most salient parts of the image. Like the chimney, there's no
Right.
point on that. It just seemed kind of curious where it was picking.
Well, so again, that image wasn't showing all the key points that would be extracted. That was kind of a subset, just because, as you saw in my picture, it just covers the whole image with key points, and you can't really see them. So that's just a subset to show some of the
Are
ones
there
that were
other?
extracted.
There must be other approaches to identifying the most salient features or points in a spectrogram. Is there a kind of direct way from other digital signal processing literature that you could change just the key point finding part of it and then keep the rest of it the same?
Yeah. So one idea I did have is to sort of combine this with the simpler, like the algorithm from Wing, the Shazam algorithm that just finds spectral peaks, and just use those spectral peaks as the key points, but extract specific descriptors from those. But again, that had the same issue of you'd have to extract a number of peaks per frame in order to deal with this occlusion issue of music content obscuring other content.
So if there isn't anything that you found, particularly in the literature, that would do that, do you have, having gone through this process, do you have ideas of what you could do that would be more spectrogram specific for either finding key points or?
I don't have great ideas at the time, but that's kind of what I want to explore. But at the moment, not really.
Okay. That's really good.
Just in the interest of time, can I ask Kira setting up while we go through this final question? So thank you so much, Colin. I think it's a really good thesis. I think very great work here. It's a very good report too. It's very concise and very coherent throughout. So I really commend you on this. So I don't really have criticisms. I have more suggestions going forward, right? So the first one, going to Robert's point. I don't know if I will pose it as an issue of saliency, because one of the things that you don't know is that if people are going to sample something because it's salient, or
right.
It's not entirely
You
clear
might
what
sample
it is.
some quiet white
some
noise.
obscure part of the recording, but SIF makes very strong assumptions about the locality of the pattern that you're trying to identify, right? So you're looking at a multiple scales at a local neighborhood around the anchor points. And spectra don't behave like that, right? Spectra have points of connection with harmonics, which are farther removed from that, immediate locality. So one idea will be to actually look at ways in which you can. So one idea that we've been exploring here is this notion of creating tensors of the spectra, where every tensor is just basically it could be like one octave removed. So you end up with a tensor where all the points which are partials are close to each other in the third dimension. Right, so you have your spectra with harmonics, and then you wrap everything one octave up. So the first harmonic is now neighbor with the fundamental, the second harmonic here, and the third here, the fourth here. So you start to create localities where it makes sense to start looking at this relationship across. So I think that will be a way towards adapting this to the specificities of the spectra, of all the spectra.
Yeah,
so it's something to look at. The other thing is that you really, because of the size of this, you don't have a chance to look at systematically at the interdependencies between all the variables,
right.
all the parameters in the system. I don't think you can do that brute force, but maybe you might want to look into ways of like randomizing the search and trying to see if you can hit a more optimal set of parameters for this, because I feel that there is more performance you can squeeze out of this, but it's hard to do.
Yeah, I definitely think you can squeeze more performance out of this. I definitely did not have time to explore all the parameters. There's a lot. I sort of stuck with the salient ones, and just in the interest of time, because this actually does take a very long time to run, especially generating all the spectrograms and extracting all the features of the 5,000 tracks.
Yeah, so you have to look at more clever ways of doing optimization there. So I think there are methods out there that you can use. It's just a matter of figuring out which one will work for your problem. And then finally, I feel that really you cannot come up with any big ideas about how to improve this unless you do deeper error analysis, right?
Okay.
And that means trying to understand what is the relationship of the errors in terms of the genre of the original track versus the genre of the derivative track. What is any changes of instrumentation, the duration of the sample, dependency on the level of occlusion of the sample in the mix, the processing that you apply, maybe even the year, because we're saying that some of this depends on when in time and which technology was used to do something. So I think it will pay off to spend some time trying to collect some of that data and trying to annotate the data set in different ways. That will give you some more insight, because I think that will determine what the next technological step should be. But right now it's kind of hard to envision. So, but again, those are suggestions. I think you did a great job. So congratulations.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
So as I'm setting up, I should probably let you all know that my wife, Leia, brought a bunch of food that's sitting back there. So to my two readers, if I can drive you all in any way, feel free. So hello everyone, my name is Kiran Kumar, and my thesis title is Score-Assisted Sound Source Separation for A Cappella Ensembles using Non-Negative Matrix Factorization. So to explain that mouthful, I'm going to describe each part of my title in bits, relating it to relevant background research, and then tying it all together into the goal of my thesis work. So I'm going to start with sound source separation. So sound source separation, in a nutshell, is basically the process of taking a mixture of audio that has sources from two different sources, so let's say a saxophonist and a vocalist, for example. Within that individual track, you can use sound source separation to extract either just the saxophone part or just the vocal part, ideally with very little or no bleed over between different instruments and no residual noise or artifacts. Now, unfortunately, many sound source separation algorithms do not achieve ideal results in all cases. So there are a variety of different algorithms and implementations that you can use for such a process. For example, principal component analysis. This is a very common linear algebra technique that is used primarily to find signals that are decorrelated from one another. So for example, a very common example, if you are recording this presentation and there's some AC unit or heating unit running in the background, PCA is able to find that statistical variance between my very dynamic sporadic speech and this constant noise going on in the background. An effect called the cocktail party problem, which is very similar. You're basically trying to identify one particular noise from a sea of other noise, whether that's a heating unit or other voices in the background, and PCA is very good at finding that statistical variance between these different signals. You can imagine, however, that PCA would not be as good for signals that are independent but still relatively correlated with one another. So for example, the musical example of the sax and the vocalist, even though these are two different instruments, they may be playing together in the same song, be playing a lot of the same notes, same rhythm, same key signature, same chord progression, and so there's a lot of similarity between these two instruments, and they therefore may be a lot more correlated. So PCA may or may not pick up on these differences as much. Independent component analysis, however, does a little better job of doing that. So ICA looks to find independence between two different signals, whether or not they are actually correlated with one another. And it does this by needing at least as many microphones or input channels as you have sources of audio. With the saxophone and vocal example, you'll need at least 2 microphones to record that performance to be able to isolate 2 individual sources. And then as you have more audio sources to analyze, you need more microphones or more channels to do this. So for larger ensembles, 5 or 10 or full orchestras, ICA is not nearly as good at performing source separation. Non-negative matrix factorization, however, is a much better candidate for larger ensembles, which is why I use it in my thesis today. So NMF is basically the process of taking a mixture of audio and trying to find any number of components or bases from within that mixture. And it does that with the assumption that the mixture, and therefore all the components within, are entirely non-negative. In the audio world, that lends itself very well to a spectrogram. So NMF basically approximates this spectrogram V as a product of two matrices, W and H, where W is basically the spectral content of each of your individual components, and H is basically the activations or the timing of data and the weights of each individual component throughout time. When performing the algorithm, by default, NMF usually initializes W and H to be completely random, to have all random numbers. And then through an iterative process, W and H will both be updated, multiplied together, and then by some cost function compared against our original spectrogram V. And this iterative process keeps going until the difference between V and W times H is deemed close enough. But instead of just giving random values, you can give W and H your own data as well. If you know, for example, what notes are going to be played during the song, or you know when each note is going to be played at a specific point in time, you can feed that data into these initial matrices, W naught and H naught. And this process of providing this additional training data ahead of time is known as supervised source separation, as opposed to the blind, unsupervised approach. So as an example, let's say that this is our spectrogram that we want to analyze. And let's say that I know that there are 5 individual components within there that I want to extract. I can run NMF with my spectrogram and with a value of 5. And from that, I get 2 matrices, W and H. W has 5 different columns, each column having the spectral content of one of the approximated components. And H has 5 different rows, where each row is color-coded to let you know how much that component contributes to the signal across time. If I multiply the two together, I get this matrix on the right, which is an approximation of V. Keyword approximation is not exact, and the quality of the approximation will depend on the training data that you give it. But you can see, at least outlined in red, that there are many similarities between the two, but in this approximation you also have a lot of residual noise. So the effects of the implementation may vary depending on many things. For now, I'm going to segue into the acapella part of my thesis. So acapella, as you all probably know, means entirely vocal. You're not dealing with any human-made instruments. And today, acapella basically has this connotation of college groups of 10 or more people singing Britney Spears songs in their basement or dorm room or something like that, as opposed to the very beautiful church music in olden times. But the emphasis, or the basic essence of it is still there. It is entirely vocal music. And as far as the research that I've done, at least, in source separation from the authors I've cited so far, I've found very little, if any, research that deals with entirely vocal groups. Basically, the research I found has been lumped into 2 categories. One is audio analysis with completely unmusical signals, like the cocktail party problem that I described. And then there's another set dealing with musical signals with more instrumental bands, where the goal is typically to extract the lead vocal from the guitar, bass, drums, and other more, I guess, predictable sorts of instruments. And the problem with voice separation, as far as I can surmise, the fact that voice separation, or the human voice in general, is a very complicated instrument. So when you're talking about the voice, you're talking about an instrument that is constantly changing its spectral content. Even now as I'm talking, my different syllables and phonemes are changing the different frequency content of even the same notes. And there's a lot more pitch fluidity, a lot more manipulations of the vocal tract that can be done that make the voice a lot more dynamic than something like a typical piano or a guitar or something like that. So extracting just the lead vocals from an instrumental band might be okay, but when you have multiple voices together, say 10 or more, then it becomes infinitely harder to find all these different individual voices and separate them from one another, because each voice is changing so much over time. But I argue that it's about time that we start tackling all vocal ensembles with source separation research, because collegiate and post-collegiate acapella singing is at an all-time high in popularity in mainstream culture. If you've all heard of the Pitch Perfect movies, 2 movies that came out fairly recently, both did very well at the box office, the American Idol of acapella, as I call it, the Sing-Off, both national shows, the latter which launched the Grammy-winning group Pentatonics into the national spotlight. So I would argue that acapella has really permeated mainstream culture in more than just this nerdy singing cliche that we're used to. And additionally, you can see that the number of a cappella groups formed between the years 1990 and 2005 vastly exceeds the number of college groups formed in the previous 80 years combined. So the point being, a cappella is not only an emerging market, but probably already a very large market that should be tapped. Additionally, to advocate for source separation for a cappella, we can take a look at a very common a cappella recording process. So when a cappella groups are often recorded, in the collegiate sense at least, it's not like a typical band that would go into a studio and play together and record together at once. Rather, a cappella groups very often will send 1 to 2 people at a time into the studio, plop each person in front of a microphone, and then they'll listen to the arrangement through a MIDI track through headphones and sing their own individual part with just that MIDI instrumentation behind them. And this is done one at a time until all of the parts have been added into the final mix, or into the session. So this allows for individual tracking in a way that group singing does not. If we have 10 people, even with 10 individual microphones singing together, there's potential for a lot of bleed over because a lot of the musicians that we're dealing with are, frankly, amateurs. I could be in tune, but the tenor next to me could be a little bit flat. So if you pitch correct his note up, mine will resultantly be sharp because there's a little bit of bleed over from each of our voices into each other's microphones. So this process allows for a little more granularity to allow for better time alignment and pitch correction in the mixing process. This naturally lends itself to a very thorough and lengthy and therefore expensive process that a lot of groups can't simply afford to pay for. But even more importantly to a lot of people is the fact that this recording process doesn't reflect how a cappella groups perform and rehearse. You rehearse as a group, you perform as a group, you're expecting to be on stage, sing with everybody together, and feed off each other's energy. If you take that away in the recording studio, then a lot of people get distracted, a lot of people get caught off guard, they don't enjoy the experience, and they don't perform nearly as well as they would do in a rehearsal or a live setting. Thus comes the goal of my thesis. I want to create a process to streamline the a cappella recording process, to allow a cappella groups to go into the studio, sing as one cohesive group, feed off each other's energies, and perform just like they rehearse and perform live. This way, we can have a source separation process, look at the full recording, and extract from it each individual track to allow for that granular individual track-by-track mixing that engineers are used to today. So this allows for that same granularity that we have right now, but also allows for the freedom and flexibility for groups to be able to perform in the studio like they perform on stage. So here's how I tried to do that. I started by creating 4 different songs, 4 different arrangements. They're all the same length, same key signature, tempo, pretty much all similarities except for a few rhythmic polyphonic differences between the 4 individual arrangements. As they progress in number, they get slightly harder, nothing too complicated. I also arranged 4 different SATB a cappella groups from a collection of people I've sang with in my own a cappella groups, previous and current, and a few singers in NYU's music tech department. I brought each group into the studio and had each person record an ascending E major scale, because all my arrangements are in the key of E major. I use each individual note from each person's recording as training data later on for my NMF process. After I gather this training data, I have the group record each arrangement several times. I let them rehearse, I have them hooked up with headphones, they can listen to the MIDI track with their own parts, get used to it, and then record this arrangement at least 3 times, still being able to listen to the MIDI track to keep them both in time and on pitch. So as a quick example of my arrangements, on the left we have the simplest one, on the right is the most complicated one. The left one is completely monophonic, all of the parts are exactly the same except for octave differences between voice parts. And on the right, we have a little bit more movement, but just quarter notes, so a little bit more of a driving force, but nothing that would really trip up the singers too much, because we only had a limited amount of time to rehearse and record. And here's the setup. I did all the recording in Dolan's studio over here across 2 different sessions, 2 groups per session, divided up into half days. So I have 4 U87s surrounding 2 omnidirectional microphones in the middle. The U87s are all set to cardioid, so that each of the 4 voice parts can pretty much have the U87 pick up their own voice part with minimal bleed over between the other adjacent parts standing next to them. The omnidirectional microphones, I have a Josephson C617, a Sennheiser MKH800. These recorded the entire group sound, and it's those recordings that were actually analyzed during the source separation process. And when I later extract or separate the Omni recordings into individual tracks, I evaluate each of those tracks against the reference data that I captured from these U87s. Here's an example of the setup in action. And I created some MATLAB code to facilitate the process. So I start by creating a magnitude spectrogram of the omnidirectional recordings. I did this using my own implementation of a short-time Fourier transform because I can better control the results and know what to expect, so I can invert the process later. I use the individual notes from the scales that were recorded from each singer as training data for my matrix W naughts, and the MIDI score data from the arrangements that I had already created, transform that into a matrix H naught that will allow itself to be recognized as timing data for the other set of the training data for NMF. And then I run the NMF process using either, both, or neither of these sets of training data, and I'll talk about those different combinations in a bit. After the NMF process runs, I get these matrices W and H representing the components and timing data. I then take each row and column of the appropriate matrices, classify them into which voice part each note or each column belongs to, put all the subspectrograms back together, and create my own inverse short-time Fourier transform process to transform that back into the time domain, thereby completing the source reconstruction process. And after I have the reconstructed results, I evaluate those estimates against the actual U87 tracks using the MIR eval Python library developed here at NYU. So a little bit more about the training data and the different code combinations. For each group and each arrangement that each group sang, I ran the code 4 times. Once for a completely unsupervised version of NMF, 2 times for semi-supervised, one that had just the scale data and one that had just the MIDI score data, and then one that was completely supervised where I gave it both the MIDI score and the scale data. And my goal, or my hope in this process, is that the more supervised data I give it, or the more training data I give the system, the better and the more accurate the results would be. So just to emphasize on this training data, W naught has the scale data. So when I recorded the scales, I segmented each note from each person and saved each note as its own WAV file. And then depending on the arrangement that I am analyzing, I upload or I audio read only those specific notes for each part in each arrangement and use that to concatenate all of them into columns of my matrix W naughts. H naught has the MIDI score data that I use for my arrangements, and I focus particularly on the MIDI score part because I know that a lot of college a cappella groups already record on things like Sibelius and Finale, which have MIDI capability. So even the least tech-savvy a cappella groups have MIDI scores. Therefore, I thought this would be a very good contribution to add to the source separation process. Hence, the idea of score-assisted sound source separation. So again, the evaluation metrics that I used were calculated using the Python MIR eval library developed here at NYU. And there are 3 different metrics that are very common in sound source separation that this process evaluated. One is signal to interference ratio, basically describing how much bleed over between other voice parts are coming into your own parts. So if I'm the tenor, I want just tenor parts, and so the higher the value of this, the less of the alto, soprano, and bass I have in this tenor part. Signal to artifacts ratio describes how accurate or how valid the source reconstruction process actually is. If there are glitches or artifacts from the actual time domain reconstruction, then the SAR value is going to be low, so we want a higher value. SDR, or signal to distortion ratio, basically describes SIR, SAR, and encompasses other both harmonic and non-harmonic distortion and noise, and is a more generic metric to be used that isn't captured by other things like the 2 listed above. So here's how this turned out. First, I'll start with the good, because we all want to see some good results. So the good thing is that supervision does help the process in various ways. At the very least, my own subjective listening, which I know is very subjective, there is more similarity in some of the parts, in some of the reconstructions between that and the original reference tracks, particularly for the bass and alto parts. The estimated basses and alto parts are often at least a little more similar to the reference bass and alto parts than, say, the tenor and soprano are. But the results are very mixed, and supervised and unsupervised, unfortunately, the results are fairly grainy and noisy to listen to. But another good part is the fact that if I provide this actual MIDI score data in the form of H naughts, the algorithm doesn't deviate too much from that, which is good. If I give the algorithm a score to follow, knowing that this is the score that people use, I want the end result to be this is the score that was followed. So that inspires some confidence there. As an example of what I'm talking about, up top I have my initial matrix H naught, which represents my MIDI score. If I don't provide that to the algorithm, often I get something like what's on the bottom. It's a lot grainier, a lot noisier, and there's a lot of basically fuzz that doesn't happen in between these gaps in the original score. If I do provide the original score, I do get some noise in the resulting, in one component in the resulting H matrix, but overall the contour and the shape is much more closely aligned with what you see in the original data, which is good. So as a short demo, I ran this code and took one arrangement in which I just gave just the MIDI score data H0. So you'll hear two audio clips side by side. You'll hear the unmixed, unprocessed version of the group recording, and then after that you'll hear what happens if I take the estimated bass part, crank it up by 6 dB, and then add it back into the mix. So it'll be unprocessed, then bass up by 6. And now bass up by 6 dB. So the bass may not have gotten louder because it's normalized, but you'll hopefully notice that some of the other parts got softer. Not entirely, because there was some bleed over from other voice parts into this estimated bass track, but hopefully you do notice at least a little bit of a difference. So here are some not good parts of my results. The metrics are basically very mixed, but overall, unfortunately, if I provide an entirely supervised approach to NMF, the average values for my metrics often fall short of the other three types of code runs. So as two different examples I have up here from two different groups, two different arrangements, the mean SDR and SIR in both cases for a fully supervised approach is the worst of all 4 code runs. However, if I give it a semi-supervised approach of just the score, not the scales, in 5 out of 6 cases here, you see that it actually achieved the best result. Over here, you'll see the actual averages for the metrics to get a little bit more clarity. Here, circled in green, is the semi-supervised approach of just H0, and you'll see for all 3 metrics, the average is highest. For fully supervised, in 2 out of 3 metrics, the result is the lowest. So some good, some bad. But likewise, the standard deviation for just H0 semi-supervised is lower than at least 2 out of the other 3, inspiring some confidence in the reliability of the data or the consistency. So there are some takeaways I can grab from here. Some supervision is better than no supervision at all. That much is true. Specifically, if you add the MIDI score data, there's much more that can be done than if you just let the algorithm run blind. And the problem with W0 is that very likely I'm underestimating the variability of voice. I'm trying to capture a snapshot of how people sing one specific note, even though they could sing the same note in a variety of different ways. And the metrics are not all encompassing, and there's some debate amongst people in the source separation field on how reliable these really are, but the subjective results differ, so we can take both kind of with a grain of salt. Future work, I definitely want to spend more time looking at the data I have, analyzing across arrangement types, individual takes, and look for pitch inaccuracies and timing issues within recordings. I may also want to test with professional singers, because if I have more reliable input data, even though I know time to rehearse and train was short, more reliable input data may in fact improve the results without much change in the algorithm. More specifically, with the actual data I provide, there's something called convolutional non-negative matrix factorization, which allows me to set up some notes as a template rather than as the end-all be-all of how this note is represented. And so if I have a hierarchical system in place, I may be able to keep my existing structure as and just expand on that rather than redoing the entire thing. And finally, incorporate a real-world situation. I started on an arrangement of Stand By Me by Benny King that I had people record, but due to time and logistical constraints, I couldn't finish the process, so I left it with these 4 similar arrangements. A lot of people I want to thank. If your name's up here, thank you. If your name's not up here, thank you as well. You've all been great, and thank you very much.
Very interesting, almost impossible problem it seems like, but it's promising in a way that the supervised was not necessarily the best. I mean, I'm curious to see what the Benny King example would show, because that would get you to where these groups could sing without having to, coordinate to a MIDI track, or you could just have them sing and then get some results out of it. Have you tried it with So have you done anything with Benny King, or have you tried?
So I had the groups sing that arrangements in the studio. I did not have the MIDI track with me, unfortunately, so they sang in a slightly different tempos, and I did not have them record scales in that key as opposed to the original ones. So I have the recordings on me. I could go through and find the MIDI track of that and still try to run that through a separation algorithm to find out what happens.
But in unsupervised, you don't need the bass score, right? Or do you need it?
Oh, you mean do it completely unsupervised? Yeah, I could do completely unsupervised, but I wanted to do this as a comparison between unsupervised, semi, and fully supervised.
Yeah,
so
I understand
that's why I left it out.
I understand for the purposes of the thesis, but I'm just wondering in terms of future application. I mean, if you could use it on existing recordings of choral works,
Yeah.
if you could use it where people are just able to sing and get something out of it, I mean, that you'd have a lot of application.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. I already have some of the data. So.
And then have you thought, I mean, even with the example you played, it sounded like, to me, I mean, it's a different signal processing problem of taking what you've got, which is a little grainy and weird,
Mhm.
and processing that to make it sound more like voices. I mean, is that
Yeah.
something else you thought of?
I haven't really tackled that problem yet. I was hoping that a lot of the graininess would solve itself if I gave it the right data. And I also try to compensate for this because when I run the NMF, there's usually a very large residual. So I thought that adding the residual back in, even after I crank up the bass part, would solve some of the graininess. Unfortunately, it hasn't. I could maybe experiment with some high-pass filters or something like that, but I haven't really thought about how to eliminate that part of the results.
So, thank you so much. Congratulations. I think you did a very good thesis. It is a very difficult problem. I'm not entirely sure I agree with your description of why it's difficult, but it is very hard, you know, that's why people don't do it in source separation. First is a little bit about the report and the way that you're presenting results here. I think you could do a little bit better presentation of those results. And there are some basic trends which are hard to see from the figures that you're providing. So one immediate suggestion, I mean, right now you have kind of like a tensor of results, right? So you have groups, you have the arrangements, and you have the initialization conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that gives you some space of 4x4x4 of results, right? And somehow in the first part of the analysis, I was just expecting to see, like, if you aggregate across the other two dimensions, you know, what is the dependency on the arrangement? What is the dependency on the group, and what is the dependency of the results on the initialization condition? And that was kind of like hard to weed from, because you were providing this very complex plot with all the information.
Yeah, I mean,
there,
basically
right?
there are so many different variables and parameters that I tried to trim it down to at least what I saw from an initial glance, what seems to stand out most of all.
Right, but just as a first layer of result presentation, I think just separating in terms of these three variables,
Sure.
I think would be interesting just to see, you know, what are the trends there.
Yeah.
And one thing that is not entirely clear, and wouldn't be clear even from that, is if you actually get statistical significances, statistical significant differences amongst the results across these conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel that you have to do some more formal statistical testing, maybe running like a multi-way ANOVA, you know, just to test, you know, what is the dependency of these variables, like something that would shed some light as to whether, you know, because I mean, like the results don't seem to be consistent across all these variables, right?
And part of the reason I didn't do that is partially a factor of how long the actual results of the code takes to run and then to run MI or eval. And because of that time constraint, I only did one take for each group arrangement combination. But you know, with more time, you know, based on your suggestion, I can do all 3 takes that I have for each one and just have a little bit more data to work with. Because I was basically a little bit unsure if I had enough data to even prove any sort of statistical significance in any of these factors.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But you know, like I think that will improve just generally the presentation. I don't think it will necessarily modify the argument that you're making or your analysis of the results. But I think it will give us some more clarity about, you know, where are the opportunities
So
for
a little more to back it up.
Now, even in the literature review here and in the report, you sort of fail to contextualize this in the context of informed source separation, which is really what you are doing here.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, there has been some remarkable progress in the community, you know, from the blind source separation standard way of thinking about this to the more informed approaches. And I think it would be nice to put your work in that line.
In the context of specifically
in the context of that,
informed.
you know, kind of like a philosophy of thinking about source separation, right?
Sure.
I don't think it will be a stretch. I mean, it's just a matter of like citing a couple of other extra words and mentioning explicitly that people are doing this in this context with these different differences from what you're doing, right?
Sure.
Still, you know, people don't do it with a cappella, so you still have that unique thing. that makes your work stand out. And then there are all sorts of potential ways in which this could be improved from a system perspective. And I guess a question that was coming to my mind is like when you use a strong initialization, so when you use the basis functions coming from the scale or the activations coming from the MIDI score, after you go through the optimization, how much those basis functions or activations change?
As far as any sort of numerical analysis on how they change?
Right. Have you looked at that?
I haven't done a numerical analysis specifically on how far they change. One thing I did want to look at in future work, just because from eyeballing the fact that providing H helps keep it less of a deviation from H, I did see that there is a fixed H argument that I could use to just completely separate it in place. So no, I've not done the statistical analysis on what the deviation is between each one, but I am interested in pursuing that and the specifically fixed H approach, since that seems to be producing the better results than W.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like basically you have the standard approach is starts from random, right?
Yeah.
And you have a way of optimizing the parameters such that you consider them to be equal weight, right? But if you have a strong initialization for H or for W or for both, you might want to play with the learning rates as you optimize.
Okay, yeah.
Because it seems, like right now you're just basically starting with something that should be pretty close to the final solution, but you're treating that as if it was a random initialization. And I think there might be some room for tweaking parameters there to improve.
Yeah, I mean, there are
where you can
a ton of parameters that I can tweak in there. So
that and sparsity, I think, it would be like a too obvious direction in which you could try to get more performance out of the system.
Okay.
So something to look at. I mean, maybe we can discuss a little bit offline, but
yeah,
that could probably help you go to the next level. All right.
Cool.
Well, congratulations again.
Thanks. Yeah, I have it.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, we're about to start the next presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi everybody, my name is Bumi Hidaka, and the title of my thesis is Listener Expectations of Reality, Perceptual Study on Editing Nonverbal Diegetic Sound Effects for Film and Video. To start, I would like to show you a quick video clip. So this particular video clip shows a action that is common in everyday life, such as walking, and also has a characteristic that is naturally repetitive and consistent across time. And this type of movement, when it's portrayed in a scene for for example, a live-action fictional film, often these movements are enhanced by using what's called diegetic sound effects. Diegetic simply means that it is part of the filmic world that is being presented in the visual and contextual narrative. In this case, the diegetic sound effect is footsteps. And I utilized just pre-recorded sound effects from available sound libraries. And you might have noticed that the footstep sound is exactly the same at every impact point. This repetitive use of sound effect instances is often avoided due to the fact that perhaps it can break the illusion of realism that the storytelling is trying to portray. But this is a rather underlying notion. There's not a prior research that actually focuses on this. But this brings me to the actual focus of my thesis, is to develop a very simple perceptual study to confirm this notion of how repetitive sound effects can actually, in this manner, can actually decrease the sense of realism, which is one goal for my thesis. And to really further understand the what people actually expect when they view films in this context. And really the more overall perspective is the creative decisions as a sound designer and a sound effect editor is trying to make. And I wanted to evaluate and encourage that creative mindset to go beyond just simply finding a associated sound and synchronizing it to the image. Why is this important? Well, in terms of diegetic sounds, that's so that actually correlates to what They just needed a minute to work.
I don't want to screw this up. Ernesto. No, I hope you want to test it first?
Do you mind if I just do a quick?
Is that? Dos.
Hi there, my name is Mike Tierney, and I'm going to be talking to you all today about loudness normalization, especially in the context of comparing two loudness measurement standards as they apply to loudness normalization in music. And I'm going to start with a listening example, two actually. And the second. Now, we all know that song. The second one, maybe to you guys, sounded a little bit fuller, a little deeper, and maybe crispier. But in fact, the first one was just 2 dB lower than the second one, which is sort of the basic guiding principle behind what the music industry knows as the loudness wars. Now, the loudness wars is the colloquial name to the gradual increase in perceptual volume via bad things like clipping and overcompression of recorded music. It's been going on basically as long as recorded music has. But from about the mid-60s to the mid-80s, it only saw a total increase of maybe 4 dB perceived level. But from the 80s to today, because of the rise of digital processors, we've seen up to a 20 dB increase of perceived level. And this is, heavily degrading the signal in favor of what producers think will attract more attention, which is a louder recording. So, one way to combat the loudness wars is loudness normalization. Loudness normalization is an algorithm that seeks to raise or lower the overall playback level for a song to a target perceived loudness level, so that all songs sound at a similar level. There should be no dynamic change, no compression added. It should be a simple, transparent gain change. And a lot of music listening platforms have an implementation. Spotify has it, iTunes, Apple Music, YouTube, Google, Fubar. Pretty much anything that you listen on probably has a loudness normalization algorithm built in. So, the problem is that there aren't really any standard practices, including how to actually measure that perceived loudness, which is kind of the fundamental principle of loudness matching in general. That brings us to the goals of the thesis. First, I'd like to compare loudest units full scale, or LUFS, and replay gain as they apply to various types of music through a subjective listening test. I'm going to discuss the two standard strengths and shortcomings, and then I'm going to advise on how to improve the consistency for different types of music. Let's start by looking at loudness units in standard. Now, the first version of loudness units was published in 2006 as the ITU-R BS 1770, which is the International Telecommunications Union Recommendation for Broadcast Standards, 1770. It's an organization with like so much clout, and it's typically seen as the industry standard. In fact, as soon as it was published, the European Broadcast Union took it up and decided that all digital European radio would be broadcast at minus 23 dB LUFS. The Advanced Television Systems Committee advised the US Congress to write the CALM Act, which makes it so that all of your television commercials play back at minus 24 dB LUFS. So you know, that kind of cloud. It's built into a lot of mastering DAWs and a lot of mastering metering suites. Isotope has it, Pyramix, Sequoia, Penguin, you know, all of the big names in the industry. It's measured pretty similar to, honestly, pretty similar to VU metering. It uses these two weighting curves, a simple high-pass filter and a high-frequency boost to account for the head shadow, and then simply RMS measured. And then, finally, the ITU thoroughly tested it with a fixed reference design, which we'll come back to the design in a little bit. Here, on the other hand, we have replay gain. Replay gain was first published in 2001 on an audiophile forum on the internet with a MATLAB script. So not quite the same prestige as LUFS, but it predates loudness units by 5 years and was pretty quickly picked up by Fubar and iTunes, later by Spotify, YouTube. In fact, most music listening platforms use replay gain, not LUFS. There's sort of an interesting quandary for producers using DAWs and plugins that all have LUFS metering when they should have replay gain metering. So, same basic principle guides the measurement of replay gain. There's a weighting filter applied and then an RMS measurement. The design of the filter has sort of a different thought process behind it, though. So David Robinson, the author, wanted to emulate a reverse Fletcher-Munson curve. So the blue line here is the average of the Fletcher-Munson curves inverted. The red line is the actual replay gain curve, so we can see how similarly it behaves to that. Finally, the green line is simply the high-pass filter that he used, which is actually, I think, just about the same as the loudness units one. Since these are the two standards used throughout the industry, these are the focus of the thesis. So, on to the subjective listening test. These are the 11 songs used for the stimuli. There's a wide range of genres and instrumentations and years. We see here the name of the song, the artist, and actually where the excerpt comes from in the song. I tried to make sure that there were no major dynamic shifts within the 15-second excerpts used. And then the actual measured values here. All the songs are pretty well known and representative of the genre and the era that they're from. There are a total of 3 instrumentals, but no a cappella songs. Some of the sources point out that vocals and broadcast and a cappella behaves differently from instrumentals, so I decided that it might be too much of an outlier for the purposes of this study. This is the GUI for the experiment. I built it in Maximus P. And it uses what's called a balanced pair matching method, in which both recordings that are being compared to each other have a fader that can be compared to match each other. According to Asbjørn Skovenborg, who wrote a paper called The Evaluation of Designs for Loudness Matching Experiments, he found that the balanced pair matching method performed better than the other experiment types that he used, because it seemed to have a built-in redundancy to it, in which he got more consistent answers faster than he did with, say, a fixed reference design, in which one is playing at a fixed level and the other needs to be matched to it. I need to get these back. All right. So, on to the data evaluation. So the data evaluation is most critical with these song comparison graphs. Basically, each of the 11 songs have their own comparison graph in which they're the so-called focus song. This is the song comparison graph for the Jackson 5's I Want You Back. What it shows is how I Want You Back compares specifically to each of the 10 other examples. So you can see here the black bar indicates the maximum and the minimum of the subject's answers. The purple circle and the green triangle are the mean and the median, respectively. And finally, LUFS and replay gain's actual measured values are represented here. And what the graph kind of tells us is how much gain should be applied to I Want You Back in order for it to sound at the same level perceptually as each of the songs. So, for example, King Kunta by Kendrick Lamar, they would need to apply a maximum of 5 dB or a minimum of about 1.5 dB to I Want You Back for it to sound at the same level. There's another graph that I made to display the data, which is the average differences between the subject's results and measurements. This is sort of taking the sum total of all the results and comparing it to the LUFS differences, which is in blue, and the average replay gain difference, which is in red. In this graph, it sort of just shows how far off the mark they were. So an answer of 0 dB difference would be sort of the perfect result. And this graph is useful as an overview, but a lot of the more nitty-gritty trends that we come to find are easier to observe with these song comparison graphs. However, this is the only graph that represents all data at once. There's not an absolute reference graph that sort of gives each song a single numerical value, because it would have necessitated a fixed reference design. And since the guiding principle of the experiment was to see how the two algorithms handled different types of material, it would call into question what the fixed reference would be. So for example, if it was something off of Thriller by Michael Jackson, and one of the trends was that older pop is perceived different to modern pop, then we might not see that trend as easily with a single reference. Also, for the single numerical values, both LUFS and replay gain use actual RMS measurement, which in designing a new standard would be used, but was not really part of this thesis. So the first trend that I noticed was with the instrumental songs. As I said, there are 3 instrumentals used. Specifically, there's Prince of Darkness, which is a Miles Davis song from the mid-60s. Serenade for Strings, an orchestral piece by Tchaikovsky recorded in the mid-90s. And finally, Wake Me Up, which is an Avicii song, a modern EDM song. And all 3, despite how vastly different they are, generally had LUFS outperforming replay gain. The reason that I thought that this would happen is that replay gain's upper mid-range boost probably unfairly affected the vocals differently from the rest of the instruments. So another reason might be that the high end in replay gain is actually not taken into account. It's filtered out. So a song like Wake Me Up, which has kind of an aggressively trebly hi-hat, would have no bearing. The next trend that I noticed was in actual high-frequency content. The graph here for Somebody Told Me by The Killers is sort of an indie pop song, but also Brain Damage by Pink Floyd, a dense classic rock song, and Little Green by Joni Mitchell, which is an old folk song, all had sort of like a thick lower mid-range and a recessed very high end. And in these songs, replay gain outperformed LUFS. The reason for this is probably that LUFS overemphasizes the high end in its weighting EQ. So perhaps boosting too much or something like that on, say, the other pop songs, like Shake It Off, as we heard, is pretty bright as it is. Sort of points to the high end of the weighting EQ not quite being right. There were also a few insignificant factors that I expected to be more significant. Most notably, the actual loudness was not a significant factor in the comparison of the two algorithms. So here I have the graph for All Nightmare Long by Metallica. This came out in 2008, and people typically joke that it won the loudness wars because it's so loud. All of these values are negative, so everyone would apply negative gain to the Metallica song. And actually both algorithms performed pretty well. And the same happened for the Kendrick Lamar song, which is also very, very loud. Both algorithms were pretty close, and neither seemed to be outperforming the others. So, in context, the overall margin of error for both algorithms, for all songs sort of, averaged, was less than a dB. To be exact, 0.6 dB for replay gain and 0.2 dB for LUFS, which is extraordinary. They both did very well. But I think it's important to sort of zoom in on these spotlights because as a one-on-one comparison, any inconsistencies would make one song sound much better than the other. Which brings me to sort of the last effect that seemed to come into play, which is the acoustic advantage. Now the acoustic advantage is pretty much saying that two sound sources that measure the same, if one of them is less transient than the other, say a sustained violin compared to a snare drum, then the sustained violin is going to sound much louder than the snare drum as measured, even in like a regular RMS meter. So here I have the graph for a song called Alex by the Punch Brothers. They're a bluegrass band, and there's a lot of dense vocal harmonies, all acoustic instruments, no drum kit, and for both replay gain and LUFS, both algorithms would set Alex too loud. So Alex would sound much better than pretty much any song that it's compared to, no matter how it's normalized. This is the same for Little Green, the Joni Mitchell song, which is only guitar and vocals. And it's the same actually with Shake It Off, which when it comes down to it is mostly very loud vocals and one or two synthesizers. It's a super sparse arrangement, and it beat the algorithms by almost 2 dB. On the other end of the spectrum, the very dense songs like Brain Damage, the Pink Floyd song, and Somebody Told Me were almost 2 dB too quiet. So if you're comparing Brain Damage to Shake It Off, then Shake It Off is going to sound maybe 4 dB too loud, which is obviously a problem. So again, less than 1 dB overall, but the consistency within that 1 dB is, eyebrow raising. So, proposed solutions. Here again, I just brought up the weighting curves. I think one solution that would have a huge impact on how well the two algorithms performed would be to take mid-side EQing into account. So as I said, with replay gain especially, that presence peak is sort of what is going to make a vocal pop in a mix. And so weighting it with an additional 6 dB is going to really bring out the vocal. So if that EQ is applied only in the sideband, then perhaps it would have a similar effect without overemphasizing the vocal. Another idea that I had would be to have a smart multi-band compressor in the very high end of the treble, because as we saw, the inconsistencies in the high band, especially between songs like Somebody Told Me, which is much darker, and songs like Wake Me Up, which is super bright, was never quite right in either of the either of the two algorithms. So having something that would weight those two equally above 10 kilohertz would have a positive effect. Finally, for future work, obviously there is more experimentation that can be done to lead to a new loudness measurement standard. Also, one could research into the inconsistencies with the human voice for broadcast, which is especially important for, say, the European Broadcast Union, which, like I said, broadcasts their radio, they're speaking over at minus 23 dB LUFS, which the speaking voices might end up sounding much louder than the music, which is, coming back to the measurement of the acoustic advantage, which has been a problem for as long as metering has existed. You look at VU metering, and it's the same as replay gain and LUFS, where the acoustic advantage sort of beats the meters no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, I thought your thesis was well written, and that especially the way you described the loudness scores was nice. It was detailed and had a better understanding of it. However, I do have a couple issues with your approach and also the context in which you ran your experiment.
Okay.
So the first is, you do a thorough job of talking about LUFS and replay gain. You include the script in your document too, but because your whole study is about perceptual loudness,
Yeah.
There's not a single mention of a psychoacoustic loudness model. And there are a lot out there. There's steady state models, there are time varying models, there are transient models, and they've been around for a long time. So I was just wondering if you're familiar with any of them and how you can relate them to the work that you did here, or maybe relate them to how LUFS and replay gain work.
Sure. I didn't really include them because I honestly didn't come across a lot of them in my research. But I think, at least from my somewhat limited understanding of them, the reason that I focused on LUFS and replay gain
Because of the industry.
was because of the industry, and because loudness normalization in general has no effect on the dynamics, which at least from a cursory examination, they would maybe affect the time factor.
Okay, but maybe I'm just confused, but you're looking at these two methods and you're trying to understand how they gauge perceptual, how they're able to match what humans actually perceive in terms of relative loudness, so the audio files can be properly normalized.
Yes.
Right, that's the point. So, but you mentioned finding new ways of measuring loudness, but isn't that what these psychoacoustic loudness models do? And they're much more complex than, can you name one that you didn't mention in your thesis that you think it might be?
No, there were a few others that were looked at in some of the papers, but typically just because of the focus on music and the focus on the impact that loudness normalization has on the industry.
But how are they different than LUFS and replay gain?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's a problem.
Okay.
Another thing is, because your experiment your thesis is focused on an experiment.
Yeah.
It's imperative that you analyze the data using some kind of inferential statistics or some way of actually showing that there is a significant effect, rather than just putting a bunch of graphs up there and saying, oh, look, here are some interesting observations. Interesting observations are fine, but you really want to back them up with hard data or hard, statistical analyses. So I think you need to have something in there that compares the relative results in the different categories. So, for example, taking absolute values of the means of the perceptual empirical data that you collected, the LUFS measurements and replay gain, and actually comparing those as means, which you don't do. And I found the graphs in general, it's good to have them, but first of all, I don't think you need the median. That just added a extra visual complexity to your graphs that didn't help.
Okay.
And I just found them a little bit confusing and hard to interpret in general because everything, it's very, you have a lot of graphs for a lot of different conditions. And what I really want as a reader is to have a nice summary and the general conclusions that stem from, these data summarized.
Yeah.
So I think, for example, if you take it's figure 4-2, like the data you show there, what you should do is just, take the absolute values of all three categories, run and ANOVA, something, simple, straightforward, and see whether there are significant differences between those three categories. And then I think you can then justify by saying, well, okay, there are clearly significant differences, great, then talk about it, rather than, well, you're not really sure whether those, I mean, you can see differences in individual songs maybe, but that's different than generalizing across all songs. Okay, so I've talked a lot.
That's okay.
Paul doing this.
So, yeah, thanks, Mike. And I enjoyed reading the thesis, and I thought it's also very well written background section, and filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge. And I've worked with LU metering, and I'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah, of course.
I had one comment similar, is that in the conclusion I felt the discussion was a little weighted and could be focused in a bit more, like the takeaway points. And also you made some suggestions about how to fix things, but I didn't feel like they were necessarily backed up properly. Like if you have and that's where the researching more perceptual studies would have helped strengthen your analysis of the results. So you said, well, I think it's because the high end wasn't compensated for. Well, you have to back that up. I mean, that as a mastering engineer from turning the knobs, but for a document, it would have more weight if you could back that up. So maybe, that's something to consider if you want to go ahead and publish or move forward with the study.
Yeah.
Okay, on to the more fun stuff. I've worked with LU meters, and I found them to be quite friendly when I'm mixing film. I know you did music, but I'm going to ask you a film question. So I found when I'm mixing the film, the way I always mix the film with -20 and dialogue and the meter on boom, -24, beautiful. So what would your advice to be to the person who wants to beat the meter?
Yes. The person
say the person
in
making a TV commercial, or more so, I think music, it's harder to beat the meter, and it seems that the anemic artists are being, not the anemic sound, but the folk artist is winning, and the heavy metal band is winning with their foot on their head.
Really awesome, right?
So they're ironically winning the loudness war now.
Yeah, I love to see Joni Mitchell as too loud, right?
Yeah. But if someone were mixing a TV commercial and there's pressure on them to bust the meter, what would be your suggestion?
So the one factor that I sort of didn't discuss, I discussed in the paper but didn't discuss in the presentation for time constraints, is that LUFS has a few gating schemes to help measure the long-term loudness, especially for film and broadcast, where you have a 2-hour film and they expect it to be -24, and people would try to beat the meter at first by keeping sections super quiet, and then just like having a giant space battle in Star Wars or something. And so they actually have a pretty smart way of gating things below a certain threshold, and then below a certain threshold of the measure. So if you're measuring for -24 LUFS, for example, then anything below -34 is gated out of.
But what's the window in which it's? I mean, say you had a piece with complete silence and then something popped up, you wouldn't be rewarded extra loudness because there must be windows.
Yeah. So
how big is the window?
The window is 3 seconds.
Oh, okay.
For like the midterm overlap, as they call it. And honestly, I think the best way to beat the meter is actually to have like a pretty consistently mid-level thing, and then still having a
momentary loudness is
momentary loudness, and which is, what we want anyways. I think LUFS is especially smart because the things that beat the meter are like the things that should be rewarded for actually having the dynamic range. The dynamicism is what.
Okay, so you're getting us something which I wanted you to bring out. So this is why the folk piece beat the meter, is because it had momentary loudnesses, and folk does this. It's quiet and it's when flux, and I mean if you watch the meters on classical music, and I would imagine that classical music a lot of classical music might beat the meter as well.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on a smart device then to prevent this, like a Dolby multiband? You mentioned multiband,
yeah.
But could you imagine something listening? What type of algorithm would it need?
For me personally, like my preferences for what a loudness normalization algorithm would do, it would not, it would not actually affect the audio file. And one thing that I do appreciate about LUFS is this gating scheme, because it takes out of account quiet bridges and fade-ins and fade-outs, and really it just it kind of focuses on how the chorus would impact a song, which is like, if a chorus is too loud, that's when you're going to adjust your volume. So having the gating schemes, I think, is actually enough as long as the algorithm measures those choruses properly. And then the loudness normalization algorithm should be able to be switched off for high fidelity, like listening, for example, with classical music. I think there's a level in which classical music will never really be normalized quite the same as others because it has that arc. But what LUFS and actually Replay Gain's weighting scheme as well do have going for them is that they'll make it so that you don't have to reach for the volume knob at the peaks, which is, for a casual listener, in a lot of cases, enough.
But their weighting is static or dynamic?
LUFS is they're both static, but they both have a way of focusing on the louder portions of the song. Like I said, LUFS has the sort of gating below a certain threshold.
So that's the only dynamic thing. Okay.
So that's the only dynamic thing. And what Replay Gain does, again, no time in the presentation, but it's in the paper, is it takes the 5% down value as the definitive Replay Gain value. So it's not the very loudest, totally clipping moment, but it's the average chorus moment, pretty much, is kind of the value that it takes from.
Okay.
I have some comments that I could just, maybe send
We'll
to
get
you
together.
or both of you, and
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you.
Hey guys.
No, I got it. Getting more advanced. Yeah, I'm gonna set the clock.
Sure. Apologies in advance, I have a bad cold, so my voice is,
Oh, okay.
I sound like a teenager, unfortunately.
Okay.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Sarah Gibble, and I studied the physiological and psychological response to subliminal sounds with a visual stimulus for the end goal of having more effective sound design for film. So what exactly does that mean? What does more effective sound design for film actually do? To really analyze that, you also need to think about what the role of film is in itself. So the role of film is to obviously serve as a source of entertainment for us. It's also a source of connection of the viewer to the protagonist, connection with the other viewers in the theater, if that happens to be your venue or your setting, a source of introspection, where we see ourselves in the world and how we can relate to the film itself. At the end of the day, though, a film's main goal is to tell a story, and for that story to be convincing enough for us to believe it. And the way that happens is when the visual and the sonic elements of that story combine in a way that is synergistic. So I'm focusing on the sonic elements of this, really. And David Sonnenschein, who is a sound designer and author, describes the sonic elements of film as being comprised of four main components. And those are dialogue, music, and then two others, which is where sound design really can fall into. And those are concrete sounds, which are anything that's really seen and heard. So if you're walking or clapping, anything that you see and expect to hear, really. And then musical sounds is the other element, which is not necessarily and often not seen to be heard, and that can establish a sense of surrealism, it can establish a time and a place, and it can also convey the emotion of the protagonist and of the story itself. I would argue that a fifth category, or potentially a subgenre of musical sounds, could be subliminal frequencies as well. So that's what I wanted to look at. In my background research, I did not find much of anything relating to empirical research on how sound design physiologically and psychologically affects the viewer. I did, however, find a decent amount on how music in film physiologically and psychologically affects the viewer. Three of the most prominent ones that I found was one done by Thayer and Levinson, which paired physiological and psychological response to different genres of music to a stressful film. And that's actually one of the experiments that I based a lot of my experiment design after. Another one paired the dimensional models of emotion with musical structure and how it physiologically and psychologically affected the viewer as well. A third one utilized dialogue as a modifier to encourage attachment, engagement, and that was also set to a stressful film. So what we see missing here, though, is sound design and how it affects the viewer. I should mention, too, that there is a lot of literature out there that does critiques on artistic analysis of films and how sound design is used in films. That's not really what I was looking at, although it's worth mentioning. What I was trying to get was a measurable analysis of how sound designers can do their job better. So what the previous studies that I found were that psychological states can be affected using music and or dialogue, but the picture is a little bit less clear in the physiological states, which means that most of their results were not as conclusive as in the psychological responses. So what I set to find out was whether or not this actually applies to sound design, and can a similar effect be achieved using subliminal frequencies. So the way I set up my experiment, as I said before, it was very similar to the Thayer and Levinson experiment. So I looked at, on the physiological side, I looked at heart rate, I looked at skin conductance level, and I looked at general somatic activity, which is basically just moving around, slight fidgeting. I was trying to see if there was any correlation between nervousness and these subliminal frequencies, and if that was creating some sort of like fidgeting. On the psychological side of it, I had them fill out a questionnaire. They initially filled out the general background information, and while they did that, I gathered their physiological data as a baseline as well. So I hooked them up to the cardiovascular, the SCL, and the range of motion equipment, and then had them fill out the general background questionnaire so I could get the baseline. Then they watched a first film, which was a 2-minute film. Now, a big difference between the films that I showed, the visual stimulus that I showed, and the ones in previous work is that I did not use a stressful film at all. I used the most boring film I could think of, which was one that I took myself of Washington Square Park at 8:30 in the morning. So, with also actually the help of Dr. Farby suggesting that. And the reason why I did that is because the results that were gathered from the previous work suggested that music and dialogue to a stressful film had an additive effect. And I really wanted to look at what the results were from the pure subliminal frequencies. And speaking of that, the subliminal frequencies that I used were 19 hertz tones, so on the low end, and a 21 kilohertz tone. So I was looking for frequencies that were right outside of the threshold of hearing, and I was setting them at a level that was also right on the edge of perception. So for most people, they probably thought they were watching a silent film twice. So the first film they watched, and that could have either been the control or the variable, each person served as their own control, so I could measure the statistics within my subjects. And then they filled out a questionnaire rating their stress levels, alertness levels, and any perceived physical and emotional changes. Then I had them watch the second film, and whether or not that was control or the variable. And then they filled out the same questionnaire. What was your stress level on a scale of 1 to 10? What was your alertness level? What were any perceived physical or emotional changes? And if you did have them, please describe them. My experiment took place in the research lab, which is right behind all of you, on the 6th floor. I used a 5:1 surround configuration. I imported frequencies into Pro Tools. I used 24-bit 96K sample rate. The speakers that are in there are Genelex. Obviously, the subwoofer was used for the 19 hertz tone. And for the 21 kilohertz tone, the monitors were used. And another reason why I chose those frequencies too is not only are they on the edge of the audible threshold of hearing, but we're on the edge of what I was able to play back. As I mentioned before, 19 hertz sine wave tone and a 21 kilohertz sine wave tone. I did experiment with other waveforms. I tried with square wave, to see if there was any sort of noticeable difference, and there wasn't. So I just stuck with those. Now I set the levels at what I'm calling a perception threshold. Because I wanted to have an even level across all subjects, what I did was I took 3 subjects that were not part of the experiment and myself, and I set the level to right where they could perceive something but not necessarily hear something, which is a little bit difficult to quantify. And I don't think that, I think the way to do it for future studies would actually be to have individual hearing tests to get a true picture of what each person's audible threshold is, because obviously my threshold of hearing is not going to be the same as my mom's, and so that's something to consider for future work. Something that should also be considered if researchers want to go in that direction is how to disclose any potential hearing issues they might find when they conduct hearing tests for subjects. This was my setup. You can see that there's the chair they sat in. They watched the film just on the computer screen. The little gray box in the back, that's the 3D motion tracker, and I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. So my subjects were 11 women and 10 men. They were aged 25 to 41 with no known hearing impairments. It was a combination of people that did have a background in audio, of musicians, and of people that had no background in it whatsoever. Because the end goal is that, hopefully this can contribute to sound design for theater settings, and everyone that goes to the theater is not a professional. So I wanted to cast a pretty wide net of what people's experience was. So my stimuli conditions, as I said before, each subject watched the film twice, so each served as their own control. So they all received one of these 4 conditions. So they either saw the variable first, with 19 hertz first and then 21 kilohertz, or the control first, or you can see I also reversed 21 kilohertz first and 19 hertz second. And I randomized all of them as well. This is just a really small clip of the film, just so you can kind of get an idea of what I showed.
It's very stressful.
I know, it's very, very stressful. Well, actually, what's really interesting, something that I didn't anticipate, and I was going to talk about later, but I should just talk about now, is that some people's stress levels were a little bit higher during whichever first film they watched because they were expecting something to jump out, they said, like when I spoke to them afterwards. So the anticipation was actually pretty interesting and not something that I had necessarily previously thought of. So the equipment that I used for the physiological side of things, I used a wearable heart rate monitor to get the cardiovascular readings. It read out at 1 beat per second, and I also used that as my experiment timer. It talked via Bluetooth to a fitness app that I did not use the fitness app that went with the watch because that only gave you a daily average of readings and not the full scale readings. So with this app, I was able to get the actual beats per second of each subject. For skin conductance level, I only looked at the tonic levels, and I sampled this at 500 hertz. Tonic levels measure about 1 to 3 minutes, so it's a longer analysis of someone's stress, whereas phasic levels is skin conductance response. So for instance, if I was watching that film and I happened to see someone I recognized in the film, that would pop up on the SCR. And I didn't want to create any additional bias with that, so I looked at the longer levels. And then the general somatic activity tracker, I used a 3D motion tracker. I only looked at the X, Y, and Z planes, which counted out at 60 frames per second. And then I took the averages of those because at the end of the day, I was looking at the difference, right? So I was looking at how much they actually moved, not necessarily what their position was. I mean, I knew where their relative position was, so I was looking at the change in that more than anything else. And for the psychological analysis, as I already mentioned, they self-reported on their stress levels, on their alertness levels, perceived physical and emotional changes, and this is pretty obvious, but as you can see, like, they obviously could not report on physical and emotional state for the initial. I did ask them if they were physically comfortable at the beginning, but aside from that, couldn't get initial readings on that. Okay, so the results. Excuse me. So the stress level showed significant effects, which was great, between the initial and the control, and between the variable and the control. What's interesting is that the initial stress levels were the highest, and not by very much between the initial and the variable, but enough to mention. And I would attribute that to just, again, anticipation, or because it's a self-report, you say, okay, how stressed out are you today? The average subject might not be necessarily thinking like, okay, right in this moment, they might be thinking about their week, they might be thinking about their day, they might be thinking about something completely different. So that's just something to take note of. The alertness levels did not show any statistic effects. It wasn't very significant. It is worth mentioning that the initial alertness levels were a little bit higher, and that the control alertness levels were the lowest. I don't know if it was maybe more relaxing, so people felt that they could zone out. Again, this was from the self-report, so it didn't come out with anything very statistically significant. The physiological, perceived physical and emotional responses were the most exciting to me as a sound designer. There was a significant correlation between physical response, emotional responses to the variable film. And I'm going to break this down in the next slide. So for the perceived physical changes, 2 out of 21 subjects reported having a physical change while watching the film, as opposed to 15 of the 21 subjects that reported having a physical change while watching the variable film. As a sound designer, this is huge, because this basically means that we can now utilize subliminal frequencies, or potentially utilize subliminal frequencies, to steer subjects' emotions and perceived physical changes without necessarily stepping on the toes of the other sonic elements of the film. Some of the more commonly reported physical changes were elevated pressure, pulsing in ears, elevated body temperature, and clammy palms. For emotional changes, it was also significant. For the control film, only 5 out of 21 subjects reported any emotional changes. And 13 out of 21 reported emotional changes in the variable film. And the most common ones were anxiety, tension, and agitation. I did have one subject who I ended up, who's in here as well, but who mentioned that she was annoyed at having to watch that film twice. So that's something to take into consideration as well. On the physiological side, excuse me, there was not a significant effect between the initial heart rate, control heart rate, and variable heart rate. It is worth noting, though, that the variable heart rate actually had the lowest mean, which I find very interesting and I wasn't expecting. And I think that because I only showed a 2-minute film, that it maybe wasn't long enough to actually have an effect on heart rate. I think if it had been maybe a 10 or 12-minute film in either direction, it may have showed a different correlation. On the skin conductance level, there was some statistical effect on this, but I interpreted this with caution when I did that because there was a machine malfunction. So I actually had to, the way I calculated the results was assuming that the sampling error was even. And so these results really should be perceived with caution at best. And because each subject started the first film at a different time, it was not possible to tell exactly where their first film watching started and ended because of the sampling error. But I still thought it's important to mention. For the range of motion, there also wasn't a statistically significant effect. It is worth noting, though, that the variable range of motion was the lowest, and this could potentially be attributed to the fight, flight, or freeze response, so the freeze part of the fight, flight, or freeze response, which it would need a little bit more studying. This could really be further looked at if it was videotaped. If this study had been videotaped, then you could kind of see if the person was just a naturally jittery person and moved around a lot, or if there was something deeper lying there. Sorry. Subliminal frequencies showed a significant correlation with perceived physical and emotional response as well as stress level, and subliminal frequencies did not show a significant effect on the physiological level, which this has been consistent with the prior work that I saw. As I said in my beginning slides, most of the physiological data that has been collected in previous work has been unpredictable. So this was not much of a surprise to me. I went over most of these except for this middle one, but I can just loosely go over this again. As I said before, preliminary individual hearing tests I think would be a pretty big deal. Again, because each person's audible threshold is different, it would really create, I think, a much stronger research plan overall. Real-time event markers, I think that would actually be something that could really help to determine whether or not my 19 hertz tone or my 21 kilohertz tone were the things that were affecting the person more. Because the subjects coming in did not know what they were going to be hearing, I only told them that they were going to watch a film twice. So I think if a future researcher wanted to take this in another direction or continue on with this, they could have a real-time event marker where they say, okay, this is where I noticed a physical change, this is where I noticed an emotional change, and this is where I'm feeling like actually a change in my stress level. And then we could really pinpoint what frequencies are actually having that effect, not just the whole variable film. And also I had mentioned before, but filmed experiments I think would be the way to go if you're studying the range of motion on such a small scale as fidgeting. Future work in other applications. So because we found this correlation between perceived emotional and physical changes in subliminal sounds, I would love to see this in a non-silent film setting. So with all the other music components, and in a theater setting. So not just with one person sitting in a room, but with everybody sitting in a theater setting, right? Neurological studies, because I showed a very boring film. I have no idea how this would, I don't know if the brain opens up, right, when it is allowed to wander to other things and maybe receive other information from that, right? So it would be interesting to see if there is a correlation between the visual stimulus and between the subliminal frequencies. If watching a film that was more action-packed led to less perception of these subliminal frequencies. Therapeutic applications. So the results that I got were all stressful and agitation results. Everybody's pretty annoyed by the end of it. But I was only really looking at 2 different frequencies, so it would be very interesting to see what other frequencies have a more calming effect. You know, if you get into like the binaural beats and the whole, there's a whole other therapeutic realm to this. I think that could be applied if you look at other frequencies. And work-related stress studies, obviously there's been, I'm sure, a lot of work-related stress studies, but how subliminal frequencies work into that, I think this could contribute to that, because there might be areas in the workplace that are actually, or machines that are generating these tones that are actually creating more stress and agitation that people don't realize. That's it.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was a very nice job and a very interesting experiment. I just had some questions about the design. Can you go back to that figure where you're showing the different stimuli conditions? I found that confusing in the thesis, so I just wanted to make sure yeah. So there are 2 films, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you say condition 1, 2, 3, 4, it almost looks like there are 4 different, films. Sort of. It's confusing.
Yeah.
So film 1 basically had one section with the variable frequencies, where it was alternating between the 19 hertz and the 21 kilohertz?
So I can explain this a little bit better. Excuse me. So if you look at like condition 1, so I only showed 4 different potential scenarios for people. They were all the same film. And when it was the variable film, so let's start with...
Oh, so they go like this way?
They go down, yeah.
Oh,
So like, let's say
I see.
I'm subject number 2. I might have gotten this condition. So if I'm
Maybe
subject number 2,
okay,
I get
that totally makes sense. Maybe you should call it ordering.
Yeah, I was
or
actually having a
something like that,
difficult
because
time trying to figure out how to convey that.
Okay,
Yeah.
but that would be helpful if that particular figure was updated, because that was where I was the most confused.
And I should also mention too, and that just to clarify, I don't think it was actually as clear as I wanted it to be, but when it says like 19 hertz to 21 kilohertz, that means that they didn't alternate, they were serial then. So the 19 hertz tone came first,
Oh, so
and then
half
silence.
of it was
Mm-hmm.
oh,
Yeah.
so it was divided into 3 equal segments in that case?
Yes, and the initial intent behind that was to see if there was to easily identify which of the frequencies was having the greatest effect. And I actually didn't I ran all the statistical analysis between those 2 as well, because I could on the physiological side. There actually
There was no difference.
Yeah, there was no difference.
Did the subjects report, just looking at what the results and what the subjects might have told you, can you guess as to which frequency or whether both had an effect?
I would say most of my subjects, it seemed on the lower end. They seemed to be feeling something weird on the lower end. I had a few, this is really interesting too, one of my friends who, this is like kind of from left field, apparently redheads are more sensitive to a lot of different things. My dad's a redhead, my sister's kind of a redhead, but my friend that came in here as a subject, she's a super redhead, and apparently they're sensitive to a lot of different things, and she was really sensitive to the 21 kilohertz tone, like very much. It was interesting. And I had another person that actually said his eyes started watering with the 21 kilohertz tone, but most people seem to feel, because I asked them, okay, can you tell me when, if you felt something, can you please describe the nature of it and when in the film it happened? But that was too vague of a question, to be perfectly honest, because some people would say in the beginning or halfway through or like kind of over here, and it wasn't accurate enough of responses for me to formulate any sort of realistic and reliable analysis on it.
Did any of the subjects actually hear something?
None that they said.
Oh, okay.
I really, like, if I had submitted my IRB, if I had thought of the individual hearing test before getting IRB approved, that would have been wonderful. But I didn't. You know, when you start these experiments, you don't think of everything, and then once you get into it, then you're like, oh gosh, like I should have, you know, I would have done it this way or this way, and that's one
So
of the things I would
you
have.
didn't ask them explicitly afterwards, did you hear something?
I didn't.
But you
Yeah.
did, and they all said no.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so there you go. They didn't
Yeah.
hear anything.
Yeah, but some people said that they felt things, so.
That's
again,
different.
It
Feeling
is,
is
yeah,
different
it's a
than-
different distinction, yeah, but no one said that they heard anything.
Okay, well
Yeah.
that's good. So I don't
It
think
is,
in
yeah.
that case, like the hearing test in this case would probably not be necessary. As long as they didn't actively hear a sound, then you can, you know,
Yeah.
argue that it is subliminal.
It is subliminal, yeah. I guess the thing that I would like to, one of the reasons why I'm interested in the individual hearing test too is because if they just can't hear it at all, like then, and what the correlation would be between people who reported no changes and no stress like differences, because there were some people,
Oh, I
and some
see.
that I noticed, you know, I had asked general questions like, what's your occupation? Did you have coffee today? Like, you know, other things. And I remember one of them, she works for a music licensing company, so she has to go to a lot of concerts, and she felt nothing, she heard nothing, there was nothing going on there. So that's why I think it would be, I like that, and she's wonderful, she's very smart, but I like that, but I do think that it would be worthwhile just to make sure that you can get on that edge.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a bunch of other minor comments, but maybe Paul,
Sure.
go ahead.
Sarah, congratulations.
Thank you.
Very well written thesis,
Thank
and
you.
I appreciate your attention to detail and stepping outside of your comfort zone, learning how to use this medical equipment that was honestly scary to me as I was seeing what you were going to do. I said, okay. So I think you made a very good argument in your thesis, and it was very easy to read and very good until the conclusion, which fell a little short. So this happens to a lot of writers. I think by the end you're like, wow, and I've said everything 10 times, but the conclusion really should work as the glue, because your conclusion was very brief, and it's not like there was anything missing in your thesis, but I felt like the arc of the read.
Like I didn't tie it together.
Yeah, I mean, conclusions where the reader goes, well, I'm really confused right now, please just one more time tell me what you did, what happened, and the outcome. Because what happens is you start questioning the thesis. After I read the conclusion, I had a lot of questions for you, but you answered them all now, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that was in the thesis. So if you go further with this study, which I think is very valuable, I would consider working it maybe from the conclusion backwards or something. Start there in your revision. But that's something that's well within your reach, because you write very clearly.
Thank you.
So I have a question on your study. Did you consider like a continuous feedback system, like a knob? Like I guess I don't know. Dr. Fergu can comment on this as well. I mean, continuous, would that have helped the study, or did you feel later?
Do you mean in terms of people being able to rate their own?
Oh, like I'm
response?
feeling
Or you
stressed.
talking-
I'm not stressed.
Yeah.
Like some kind of continuous thing.
So I did consider that. One thing that I talked to a few people about this that had a little more experience in this area than I did, especially in terms of experimental design, and I did consider it, but I think that I didn't want to give someone I didn't want someone to rate something just because they felt like they had a task to do. So I didn't want, like, here's this dial, so just rate whatever. And I thought that, if I gave them this part of the questionnaire right after the film, it was a short enough film that they would have time, or that it would be fine for them to recall how they were feeling, and they wouldn't feel like they needed to necessarily rate, like, oh, I'm feeling like this because I haven't rated in a while, maybe, or I haven't, I need to rate because I have a task. And also because I was dealing with subliminal frequencies and everything else in the film was silent, I really wanted their attention as much as possible, and I thought that the real-time dial might have taken away from their attention.
Yeah, I think if it were real time, the problem is, say someone walks, by, right? Then that's kind of slightly more exciting.
Yeah.
So it could be that they'd
Interesting,
be
okay.
responding to the visual,
Yeah. I actually did have
individual visual.
Okay, good, good.
2 subjects that I actually had to throw out, but they.
Literally thrown.
Yeah, no, but they actually, I had 2 people that recognized someone walking by.
Really?
Well,
Wow.
with the NYU students and I record at NYU, and you're bound to
Okay.
see somebody. So, yeah.
Good, and you spoke a bit about future work not being in silence, but what drove you to choose silence over? I would think it's a little distracting, no sound on the film, like people looking around, and is there a camera on me, or I might think it's pretty strange where if there was a little sound,
A little something,
it might have
yeah.
put them
Well,
more at ease or something.
sure, yeah, and that's the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal is to have this as kind of like an injector underneath what is an otherwise normal film to help just have a different way to sway emotions. And one of the reasons for me getting inspired to do this was actually a film that I saw that I ended up feeling very physically upset about. And I found out that they were actually had like a 24 hertz pulsing tone that was correlating with this red pulse visual that was going on. And I did more research on it and found out that actually made a lot of people physically ill and rather upset. So that was the segue into it, but I wanted to see if it was really just like the frequency or if it was the combination of the visual stimulus and the sound. And I thought that to get the purest response from that and to kind of cast the widest net, since there wasn't really any prior research that I had found that's empirical research on it, that I should start with the purest.
Okay.
Yeah.
One last thing. So you talked a bit about physical and emotional reaction, and am I correct? There was a pretty high correlation between physical and emotional.
The response with the
Yeah.
variable film, that was my biggest.
So people are moving. When they get upset, they move, right? And I was wondering, just from a psychoacoustic thing, do you think they're trying to get out of the bass? Like, did you check for modes in the room? Like, because when you're in low frequency, you can kind of move your chair and get out of it. Like, so did anyone? Do you think that was an issue, or did you discover anybody actually trying to get away from the low sound, or they didn't know?
No, I didn't see anyone trying to get
Get more
away.
comfortable, or more like?
A little bit, but I mean, and when I say a little bit, I mean like just like that. But the range of motion, the physical responses that I got, the physiological ones that I got, were not. There wasn't like a correlation between them, but the perceived physical changes. So anything that they noticed about their body, basically, that's where the high correlation was with the variable film. So like again, the clammy palms, the sweating, like weird pressure. All bad things, unfortunately. It was more that, and that was from the self-report, but anything am I answering this right? Am I answering your question?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were getting at.
No, I said if someone hears like, say there's an uncomfortable mid-frequency, someone
Yeah.
would turn their head and not knowing what they're doing actually, but
Yeah.
to mitigate it with their HRTFs or
Yeah,
bass, if you
yeah.
move, you can get out of it. Like I
Right.
know this, but I think I've seen people do this intuitively. Like when they hear something loud, they twist their head around until it stops.
Yeah.
You know,
and
so I was wondering if you witnessed any of that.
I did not witness any of that at
Yeah.
all, but I think also because these were set at such a again, not just the level outside of the level of hearing, but on the perception threshold, they weren't really that loud. Like it really affected me when I was first setting up this experiment, but that's because I was in there for a long time, you know. So it had a significant effect on me a lot, and I definitely was moving out of the way, but I didn't see any of the subjects doing that. And part of that I think could also be, I didn't introduce the sounds as like a pop. You know, I kind of had an easy introduction to it over, I would say, I don't know, 3 seconds or so that there wouldn't be any sort of like shock to anyone's senses if they weren't particularly sensitive to that. Right, fades on it basically. That makes sense.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay.
But did you mention the fades, the fading in and out in the document? I don't remember reading that.
I don't think I did, but that's something that I could
Yeah, you should
definitely
definitely put
mention.
that in
Yeah,
there.
for sure. We should do that.
I think we're all good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.